How can kids?
No, wait a second.
Oh, no. Sorry.
Wait. Several.
Okay.
Okay, so,
No one can see you, Sherry. Hold
all right, they
on.
don't.
No, it's good. You know, it's not, hold on, wait a moment.
But they can see me.
In last week, I don't know where's it last stream.
Sherry, you call and,
Oh, I am bending down. Did you see that there's a new book coming out that just came out of Israel called Nimuchonet? Yeah, it's a children's Hebrew book with illustrations. It's all about this little short girl, and I'm Nimuchonet. That's my.
oh, now we're ready to go.
So join audio, and there's all kinds of things that Jim. There's all kinds of things on the screen. Later, join audio. I don't know what that is.
Thank you all for coming out in this weather and showing us that we're all loyal fans of Ilana. Yes, that's been that too. And we have Ilana doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to introduce her anyway. She has worked in the field of complex trauma and self-care for 35 years. She stepped down from her position with a nonprofit agency after 25 years, having developed and led programs serving people affected by complex trauma. She is currently in private practice consulting and training on issues related to fostering resilience, team building, stress management, complex trauma, sleep challenges, and laughter yoga. She has led seminars on these topics nationally and internationally. Ilana was deployed by Israel, a major international humanitarian NGO, to multiple disaster zones, including Nepal, Puerto Rico, and Chico, California. During the pandemic, she led webinars on how to deal with stress and anxiety for agencies around the country, as well as clergy and UN diplomats. And I'm having finished the book last night. I was cramming. The book is wonderful. There's a lot of insight and advice. I wish I had read it when I first retired, but I'm still retired, so I can still learn and grow, and we can all hear from Ilana.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. This is fantastic, given the snow and given the fact that in New England, winter is always winter, the whole winter. So we can't just sit home. I don't want to sit home, and I appreciate that you all came here. This is very exciting for me. And this project has been a labor of love. And while I was working on the book, I really did not know who would want to read it. But apparently I really needed to write it. And now that I have, I hope that you will find the time to read it. And I know that some of you already did that. So thank you for doing that. I had a lot of help in writing this book, and I want to begin by thanking my fantastic editor, Karen Khan, who helped me elevate my voice throughout the book. Without her wisdom and skill, this book would probably have told a different story, if at all. I also have heartfelt gratitude to Yaron Regev, who helped me publish this book on Amazon. He's my Israeli editor that actually done all the work that needed to be done to Amazon because I know nothing about it. And I also want to thank my collaborators who are national and international experts in their field, and who are also my friends. I know you will see when you read it that I'm blessed to have such great friends. And they were unselfish in their sharing of time and wisdom with me, and I thank them for that. And my two dear sons, Idan and Maor, they're both better writers than me, provided many comments and much encouragement during the writing process. And I thank them from the bottom of my heart. And last but not least, I want to thank my husband, who's sitting right here, Mark, who is always the wind behind my back. And his astute editing skills, support, and love continues to inspire me. I love you all very, very much. Now I want to tell you a little bit about how I came to think about write and self-publish a book in what is my second language, English. In fact, this is my first book in any language. I can tell you that it took me over 2 years to write. On top of about 10 years, I thought about the process of stepping down and what to consider before making such a move. As many of you know, I had 2 brain surgeries, one in 2006 and another in 2012. And the purpose of both surgeries was to remove a benign tumor that grew on my pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is the gland behind your eye. And that was wreaking havoc on my entire hormonal system. This pea-sized, a really small gland, this pea-sized gland is the master gland that controls all the others. So the surgeries were ultimately successful. And if the fact that I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro a few years ago and recently rode my 18th, recently, this is last year, I'm already training for my 19th, but last year was my 18th year in the Palmas Challenge, isn't proof enough that I'm doing fine. Nothing I can say can actually suffice to demonstrate that I'm doing really fine. 2 brain surgeries, you wouldn't know it. I don't even know it. The first surgery was, in fact, a shocker. Me needing surgery, really? Like, what's going on? The second was a true wake-up call. The idea that life can turn on a dime was sinking in for me. And I started to think about what I wanted to do with the time that I'd left and how I wanted to live my life moving forward. I started to think about life after the guidance center that has been my professional home for over 25 years. I had no interest in finding another place of work. Even after the agency merged and most people left the organization, I stayed on and I was able to work in the programs that I developed over the years. I remained happy and fulfilled in my work, so I did not want to leave, and I didn't believe that I would find another place that would be comparable to this place. So while I wanted to leave my place of work and the responsibilities that came with it, I did not want to leave my professional self behind. I have been a social worker my entire professional career, both here and in Israel. Come to think about it, I've been a social worker my entire life. I spent time tutoring other children when I was 12. When I was 14, I volunteered at School for the Blind in Jerusalem. And my job there was to read to the blind students from books that were not available to them. At age 16, I volunteered at Hadassah Hospital. I then returned to Hadassah Hospital as a social worker many years later. And as a senior in high school, I volunteered at the emergency center at the Jerusalem municipality during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, something that many of my classmates did all over the city. So I really could not leave this part of my identity behind, since from early age, it was integral to who I am and who I was, and it remains central to who I am as a person. You also all know me from years of Torah discussions here, that my comments are almost always geared towards social justice, other than the times that I do some Hebrew translations, and involvement and participations, and elevating the voices of those who are disenfranchised. I often focus my remarks on thinking about ways to assist them out of their predicament, which is often caused by a lack of opportunities throughout their life. Indeed, my work at the Guidance Center focused on programs for people affected by domestic abuse and who experience complex trauma. And as part of my work at the agency, I was also a member of the diversity, equity, and inclusion committees in their different incarnations. And I led workshops and training on these topics throughout my entire time at the Guidance Center. I understood on a very deep level the suffering of those less fortunate than me and tried to do my best to help. Given the fact that being a social worker is who I am, I did not want to retire from that part of myself. After all, how can one retire from one's own soul, right? So, since you all know me and you know that I'm a planner, it should not surprise you to know that after these surgeries, I started to plan. And after 5 years, and 5 years after the second operation, I left the Guidance Center and the programs that I developed and loved. And it was during those 5 years that I started to think about writing this book. This was a process. I'm slow processing, you can say. I want to read to you a page from the preface that will highlight a bit about my process and my thinking. And I will also read to you who did I dedicate my book, because that's also part of me. But before I read from the book, I want to describe what actually is in it. The first 3 chapters highlight my preparations regarding how to best step down for my professional career in a way that will not have me stepping away from my professional identity as a social worker. My professional life gave me purpose and meaning, which I did not want to lose. And the next 8 chapters are centered around interviews that I conducted with experts in a variety of fields that I think are particularly relevant for those moving forward from formalized work life. For example, to gain a perspective, I interviewed my dear friend and centenarian, and some of you know her, 100-year-old Millie Kravitz Gugelman. She's going to be 101 in about a month, in the end of this month. She's a social worker by training. There is a chapter based on my interview with Ellen Simpson, an accomplished financial advisor and former professor, that addressing a key question on everybody's mind: when can I afford to leave? I interviewed my living expert, Mark, about what it means to age in place and what are the right steps to take to assure that I can age in my home, something that I'm most certainly planning to do. I have my kitchen of my dreams. I have my Zen garden that took me 10 years to create at the backyard of my house, so I'm not going anywhere. And other chapters are devoted to answering such questions as, how does one advocate for oneself in a culture that is cherishing young people and doesn't look well on people like me who are getting older? How can we ensure appropriate healthcare as we age, which is really an important piece? Are there things that we can do to keep our minds sharp? And how can we leave a legacy and assure that we live a purposeful life with no regrets? Tall order for my chapters, but I felt that the people that I interviewed gave me some answers on some of those questions. Each one of the chapters starts with an autobiographical piece and part from my own life. And after the interview is presented, I call out what I think are the important life lessons and takeaways from the conversation. I had many questions. I always have many questions. And the book does not answer all the questions that might arise when confronting such change. I know that I have learned a great deal during the many hours of listening and writing. And at the end of the day, I hope that any of you who might read the book will be able to enjoy it, first and foremost, and use it in your own processing and planning. Now to the reading. And I will read a little bit to give you a sense what's in it. Conveniently, I have one. So I want to tell you who I dedicated this book to. So I dedicated this book to my father, Avraham Amani, of blessed memory, who died at the age of 44 and sent me on a lifelong quest to live life to the fullest every day as it can turn on a dime. My grandmother, Rachel Babai, of blessed memory, who was a healer and taught me how to care for people and was a huge presence in my life. Bertha Katzman, of blessed memory, my husband's grandmother, who was a wise woman with a zest for life to her dying days. And I dedicated my book to Mildred Kravitz Guberman Millie, my 100-year-old friend who is teaching me how to live and age gracefully, and that she does. And my mother, Shoshana Amwani, who showered me with love throughout my life and continues to do that to this day. It's a lot of thanks for other people. You can read those. So I'm going to the preface. So I'll start by reading to you a quote by Sophia Loren, right? Who would know? Here's a fountain of youth. It is your mind, your talents, the creativity you bring to your life, and the lives of people you love. When you learn to tap this source, you will truly have defeated age. Sophia Loren, I truly believe that. And I'm not going to read from the entire book. I want to read so I want to read a piece about who was my guide in even thinking about retirement. So my sister was 15 months younger than me, flew to the United States from Israel when I went through the operation. And 2 years later, my sister left her job at the age of 51. She had reached the glass ceiling in the government agency when she had spent 25 years as she sought new challenges. Her journey informed mine. By the time I left my place of work, I was 62 years old, and it took many years of thinking and planning to reach that moment. My sister Michal was my role model and guide regarding how to carefully plan to have a meaningful stepping down. Like me, she began her career as a social worker and then switched to something more suited to her skills and talents. And by the time, I actually don't know what she did. Nobody knows what she did in the Ministry of Defense. Like, we don't know. It's all secret. By the time she left her position, she had developed a third career. As she thought about retirement, she planned for it. She took classes over multiple years and participated in workshops to develop the skills necessary to become a life coach. She planned meticulously and left with no regrets. That was what I needed to do. I applied the lessons I learned from my sister and carefully charted the path to the next phase of my professional and personal life. I decided that I would leave my agency to focus on the aspect of my professional life that I loved the most, teaching and consulting. I wanted to concentrate on how to use our strengths and resilience to deal with different traumas, to use my creativity to develop workshops and games that would help open up conversation about ways to heal from trauma in a soft way, without barging through defenses, but by using art and creativity to hone resiliency skills, which is what I did and what I do in my workshop. I wanted to help people create stories and find their voices and narratives. I also hope to be able to do this work in the context of international humanitarian aid, an area I began to explore a couple of years before I left my agency. For all of this, I would need to learn new skills, develop and strengthen relationships that would help me find the work I wanted to pursue and prepare personally for change that would affect my day-to-day life and life and the life of my family. So I have another piece that I want to read, but I think I talked a lot now. And I want to see if anybody has any questions or any thoughts or any feedback or any ideas.
I have a question that maybe you should answer at the end.
Before you ask the question. I don't know what's my name.
You don't answer this at the end. Is spend off what you got in the 50. So you start what she did. And then you could adapt that to your own. Looking back on how you did it, what would you do different? And what would you think afterwards in the same? But I think this question to me.
No, I can answer the question. I have to say, since I planned for such a long time, I don't have any ideas that I would do things differently. I really don't. I mean, I wish there was no pandemic. So I think that would be different, but the pandemic was sort of a blessing in disguise because I wrote my book during the pandemic and I learned about Zoom things I had didn't know anything about. And I can teach people about different aspects of Zoom, and by no means an expert. And anytime I get stuck, I have my living expert on Zoom that comes to help me. He's much more proficient on Zoom. But I think that I'm very comfortable with where I am, and I was very comfortable for where I was. I actually stopped seeing individual clients. I said goodbye to my individual clients in March of that year. I left in June, and she spoke in the gala for our agency. And the day after the gala, I told my supervisor that she has me there for 3 more years. She almost fell off the chair because she didn't know that I would actually leave because everybody else left. And so I felt like I really planned meticulously. I talked to people. I learned a lot about myself in the process. I learned skills, which you can read about in the book as I was preparing for the 5 years that I was preparing. I actually converted my entire professional article collections. I scanned them and I have them on a flash drive, my whole library, and I threw them away. And so, yeah, that was a cleansing of sorts. So I felt very ready, and I don't think that I would do much different. Okay.
I'm curious.
Yeah, it's okay.
We could go with it. I'm curious, Ilana, I'm curious if you had to worry or concern yourself with money in this process, or if you think if you did it, if you think that you had to, how would that have changed your planning or your calculation?
Well, there's a whole chapter in the book about the financial question, which is the first thing everybody asks. And I did too. Mark, my husband, left his corporate work a couple of years before, and going from corporate world to the university meant a cut in salary. And so I needed to think whether not earning salary or that kind of salary would actually change. And so I had sessions with the advisor, and we calculated and we thought, what would that be, and how can we continue to have the kind of life that we want to have with the savings that we had. So there was a whole process around this, and I can definitely think question. And so my process you can read about in my book, but that is a serious question for a lot of people. And I did not want to be in a predicament where I would retire and then find that I'm in financial stress and then look for another job. I definitely didn't want to do that. But there's a whole more about that in my book and in my conversations with Ellen Simpson, that is the financial advisor that I interviewed for the book. I don't know if that answers.
So thank you very much. I would imagine that in your professional role that you dealt with complex traumas of people from many different cultural backgrounds.
Yes.
And in this project, I'm curious how, your perspective as an Israeli American, and the Israelis and the Americans who were your models, how they influence your idea about the cross-cultural way in which you approach this topic.
The topic of
the book.
Of the book. So I'm not from here, and you only need to listen to me to understand that I'm not from here. My accent is not changed. It's sometimes thicker, then sometimes not as thick, but my kids remind me that all the time, as is my husband, especially when I say different words in a way that are not meant to be said. When I curse, which I do nothing of that in Hebrew, I can curse like a sailor in English, and I don't have the musical sense of what it means. In the same juiciness that people who grow up in this country would do, I would never say the things I say in English, in Hebrew, that I do say really in English. So, plus I come from a country of a lot of cultures. And growing up in Israel, you grow up with a lot of cultures and a lot of isms and a lot of prejudice. And so I was in Israel, the kid from the hood. If there was a medical program in Israel, which there wasn't, I would be the one. I had to travel from my high school, from my house to my high school with 2 buses and go through the valley and get there. And to this day, I don't have one friend from high school. This is me, who has a lot of friends all over the world. So there's that. And I think that also living with trauma in Israel, this is a culture that has been plagued by a lot of wars. And I was a lot of wars, and there were a lot of death in my family, not just from the wars, but people died. There was a period of 10 years where 5 people of my family, including my father, died. And so there was a perpetual sense of grief. So I could understand on a very deep level the helplessness that comes with trauma and grief. And so that was the background of why I went and probably got into the work that I've done. Because of all that, and because of the fact that I was an Israeli that came to this culture, came to this synagogue, by the way. So I never went to synagogue in Israel. Once, at the end of Yom Kippur, I went to synagogue to hear the concluding services. I'm here almost every day, every Saturday that I'm here. I was a gabbai, I read Torah, I did bat mitzvah. It's crazy. So that stuff is actually informed my work and my book. I tried to think about the people, the disenfranchised people, like people that suffer from ageism. And anybody and you probably know that anybody who's not a white male in the medical realms doesn't get a very good treatment, and unless they speak up. So I speak up. So I speak up for myself. I'm pretty assertive, and I come by it honestly. And I was very good in speaking up for people. Most of the people that I've seen were not white. They were white and they were high class. Because domestic abuse goes everywhere. So I was able to do that. And some reflections of that work is also in the book. And part of it was some of the chapter about how to ask questions that started in Lowell by the Right Question Project, which is a fantastic project. And some of it is in the medical stuff that I write about, how to actually advocate and what to do. Definitely informed who I am. And plus, I was part of, as I said, I was part of the diversity, inclusion, and equity committees throughout my entire professional life here. So I don't know if that's answering questions.
Great, thank you.
Also, before we ask more questions from this group, is there anyone on Zoom who would like to unmute themselves and ask a question? And if so, please do put your camera on so that Ilana can see you. Go ahead, Lois.
Hi, Lois.
Hi. I just want to say I read Ilana's book when it first came out, and I highly recommend. She did a very thorough job in all the different areas. I know that I went through this process myself, and it was very interesting to read. Actually, about her life, what she was doing is very impressive. Is what she does as a social worker, her depth, her empathy, and the one question I have for Ilana, I noticed in the book I couldn't find, you gave ways for elderly people to remain resilient. You didn't mention that I remember anything about keeping physically intimate, and I don't want to go into it too much, but I think it's important for older people to continue, if they have a partner, to be, let's say, intimate and for however long.
Yes, I mean, there is a lot of self-exposure in my book.
Well, that's okay
and
that you didn't expose yourself.
Those of you, yeah, there is a lot of autobiographical pieces in my book. And those of you who read it know that, and that is thanks to my editor who actually pushed me to write more in depth about my own experiences. And so there's a limit, and the limit was at the door to my bedroom. So, but it's true that is very important. And it's an important part of life to be intimate, to have social connections, to continue with life. I mean, people who are older have desires and have activities in their life that keep them physically active physically. I talked about being physically active as in exercise in my book. But you make a very good point, and maybe you should write that book, Lois.
You can be the autobiographical. All right, go ahead, Terry.
Yes, sorry, my phone is ringing. Ilana, you are a bilingual person, and as someone interested in languages, I'm just curious if you find yourself at all working in any way differently when you work the Ivrit and when you work in English, when you work in Hebrew and English. Is there any difference in your way of communicating or what comes to the top or so, anything like that? I'm just curious.
Oh, Harriet. Yeah, I'm so fluent in Hebrew, and I can read and I can cite and recite anything and everything. I can do a crossword puzzle, which I cannot for the life of me do in English. My English is okay as it is. I wrote a book, I did my PhD, I studied there, is never going to be as good as my Hebrew. I would consider myself to have a very high level of Hebrew, but in English, I have a mediocre level of knowledge. Despite what all of you might think, I'm much freer when I speak in Hebrew. However, there's a caveat. However, since I've been living here for so many years, too many years, when I go back to Israel, I find that I cannot enter a conversation unless I'm completely aggressive, and I'm not aggressive as much. In my family, I cannot, my sister, and my brother, and I have to ask them, which actually just happened. We went to talk about my mom, God bless her, situation, whatever. And I had to say, Do you want me to say something? Are you sure you want me to say something? Are you going to be quiet when I say something? Are you sure? It's like I had to do that for them to actually start laughing and actually shut up. Because my sister and my brother do not shut up. And so, and especially my sister, my brother, I can shut him up. He's 7 years younger than me. My sister was 15 months younger than me. I cannot shut her up. Professionally speaking, sometimes I'm struggling in Hebrew to find the right concepts to pass on when workshop. I did workshops in Israel, and I have to kind of think twice because most of my learning and my professional, I worked in Israel before, but most of my professional life was here. So I'm like, I don't know. I'm in here and I'm in there and I'm in between somewhere in the ocean.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, anyone else? Looks like that's it. Okay, anyone else in the room? Yeah, go ahead, then. Let me just grab you the thing here.
Thanks. Ilana, I know very good.
Thank you.
And question about family structure. You talk about yourself, and maybe you included conversations to your story.
Yes.
And you were very not asked all the way.
Yes.
You could have written what I told you. You could have written about hospice care and et cetera, et cetera. Like, why don't you decide to have the conversation with people, and then you see that as part of the book?
It's a very good question. Nobody ever asked me, but I count on you to ask me that question. Well, first of all, the beginning of the book was my own process, what I did. So that was natural. And all kinds of questions that I actually didn't know the answers to. I didn't know, I knew a lot about aging in place because we had conversations, but I didn't know in depth the different topics. And I really wanted to do a very thorough understanding of what it means to have that kind of step, so that when I do that, or when after I did that, I'm informed. And so I decided to do that in a form of conversation because this was not my right, it was not my words. I wanted to be honest to the people who gave me that material. And therefore, I talked to them. I actually taped them and I transcribed it. And I did very light editing to make sure that it kind of makes sense. And I actually sent it to them to find out whether I actually captured the conversations and if they had any kind of small editing. So I'm happy to say that they were very happy with what I wrote and thought that I captured the conversations well. And I wanted to give them credit because they actually helped me a lot in understanding in depth what it means. And writing about all this just as a research would not give me, I didn't feel was rich enough. I wanted to include, I'm an inclusion person, right? I wanted to include other people and I wanted to learn from their perspective about the kind of work that they did that informed my questions. Two different chapters were the one with Millie, the 100 years old. This is about gaining perspective. I write in the book and I can say, and you know that well, my husband tells me that I'm what is that? I'm following my own drum.
There's somebody that sounds.
The complete, I'm beating on my own drum. What is that? March to my own drum, which is true.
There are lots of ways.
Once in a while, I'm also wanting to have feedback and I want to get input. And Millie gave me a perspective about what it means to be a social worker in the 50s and what were the conflicts and the complications of life and work at that time, which felt to me like, wow, this is what's happening today. We've done a lot of work towards equality of women. This is to answer also some of your question, Ellen, but we still have a lot of work to do in terms of equity, right? And the other one was my brother-in-law, Danny Blorian, who wrote a book called Hospice Sophie, Hospital and Hospice and Philosophy. And his book, I totally and absolutely recommend to you, is available on Amazon, is about his work in hospice. And that was about how you live your life without, how you end up at the end of your life with no regrets. What can you do today to get to that place? So that was more like an inspiration. And I wanted to put that forward. So the others were questions I really were interested in. So I decided to include those in the book in the full richness of the conversation, rather than me hearing them and then summarizing. Didn't feel to me like it would be as authentic and as true to the people that my friends, my wonderful, unbelievable friends that helped me with this book and that I interviewed them. And the interview was the questions that I had to them. And they were incredibly generous in explaining those concepts and those ideas that I wanted. So that was, I don't know if I answered the question.
You did. I just want to say that it worked.
Oh, thank you.
And you were able to get into the mind and the sense of your interviewees. You described them quite wonderfully.
Well, thanks very much. I come, honestly, that's my profession, to be a trained listener, right? Oh, Ellen.
So just another question. So we're here at the end of Shabbat, and you've been a regular member of Worship and Study forever. And
I will be here until this train is no longer running. Just wanted to say.
Okay, well,
Wheels fall off.
No, I'm here.
Rain comes in.
Yeah. My question is, can you just sort of just reflect a little bit on what your Jewish identity, your Jewish education, your involvement with Jewish groups, like and worship and study and other groups, how that has affected your work and is how that's reflected in this book?
Well, there's a whole part of the book that actually came in the almost the last piece that I wrote was about spirituality and how important it is to have spirituality in your life as you age. And in there is a chapter about worship and study. That's been my spiritual home. And in my work in general, since I'm not from this country, I talk religion and politics, not with my clients. I don't talk politics, but I definitely and absolutely talk with them about spirituality. That doesn't always have to be going to a synagogue or belong to a religious institution. Spirituality can be just walking in nature and feel that you are one small part in the universe. Spirituality can be like, walking in sunrise and seeing the light going down the branches of the tree and realizing, wow, we are witnessing the earth moving on its axis, right? It can be different way. I always talked about spirituality with the people that I've seen, also, especially because many of the people that have been affected by trauma and domestic abuse, especially, have been told by their religious leaders to stay for the sanctity of the marriage, which is a total, absolutely bullshit. So I helped them find places and congregations where this was not the case. So it is an important piece of aging. It's an important piece of health for me. And this place, which I've never been a part of a place like this in Israel, I've never sat with my family in synagogue. I never led services. My mitzvah, which I had in Israel, was a party, like everybody else at age 12. This is why I spend a lot of time with Sherry and Jim and with Mark and many other people and with Arthur, who taught me for my own bat mitzvah. And actually, I took the process of creating my own talit with the writing on it and whatever. It took me, 5 years we were talking about it, Sherry? About 5 years I was talking about making my own talit. So this was meaningful to me. This congregation was meaningful to me. Ben Zion was meaningful to me. I love this congregation. So that's why I'm here until the end of times. And so that definitely informed who I am as a person here. I'm a proud Israeli, I'm a proud Jewish woman, and I'm proud to be here. I don't know if that gave you.
Yeah, Sherry had the same question, so let me customize it to her. And see if we can answer it.
No, you were exactly the question. That was exactly.
In the book, there is a chapter about work and study. That was almost the last piece. I said, wait a second, I'm talking about spirituality. I haven't written anything about it. I have to write this. So I called my editor back. I said, look, we have to add this piece in because that's not complete. I have to put it in. So it's kind of the last thing that went into the book. Okay, so this is like in the old tradition of Ben Zion Gold. I don't want to keep you here. It's going to be a burden. So let me read to you a very short piece from the last chapter of my book, which is the chapter 11th, No Regrets, Reflecting on Living a Life of Purpose with Danny Blorian, my brother-in-law, who wrote that book called Hospice-Sophie, which I recommend to you to read. There are over 10,000 people that actually downloaded and bought this book. It's on Hospice-Sophie. I will send the congregation the link to his book after Shabbat. It's an incredible book. You cannot read it in one sitting, but it is a book that should be in every house. Okay, so I don't want to read too much. Just be sad. So my brother-in-law is a very unique individual. This is your sister's husband? Or? Yeah, sister's husband was an Israeli. Okay, so I don't want to read, there is a part in here that if I read it, I'll start crying, but I don't want to do that. So I read the end. So my conversation, this is an example of what I sometimes write at the end of every chapter. My conversation with Danny surprised and inspired me. I was fascinated by his story of becoming a hospice volunteer following a long career in police force. He was a high in the intelligence in Israeli police, like a unique guy. Through his volunteer work, Danny had found new purpose and meaning. As he said, working in the hospice has been the biggest gift of life. Through his story, I realized that the next chapter in life could be profound and full of surprises. Danny followed a path similar to my own and my sister in that he intentionally prepared for retirement. He learned new skills and he made sure he had the financial resources, the question that you asked, to pursue his passions. At the same time, Danny was open to possibility. He did not plan to work at the hospice, but his journey took him there. Danny's openness to new experiences is also evidenced in his discussions of learning to be comfortable with not knowing. When we no longer feel we must have all the answers, we view the world with wonderment and open ourselves to whatever comes our way. When this attitude is combined with a clear-eyed view of addressing life's regrets, we can ensure we live our final years with meaning, hope, and peace. And I'm going to stop here. Says one and done.
She wanted to write a book before she died, and she did it.
I'm not planning to die yet.
No, good. Thank you, everyone on Zoom. Thank you. Bye, everybody.